So what is your field?
My field is international relations. I combine international law, international political science, and public policy, the three of them together.
How was your field when you started?
It was very different, you know. I was educated in the late 1960s, early 1970s. The Cold War was still going very strong. The United States was in the midst of a horrible Vietnam War. The field was characterized predominantly by the strong role of realism as the leading philosophy of world politics. Realism came back in as a reaction to the peace movements and their failure during the 1920s and 30s, and a sense that the world was a very dangerous place. The competition with the Soviet Union, you know, characterized so much of U.S. diplomacy that it also shaped the worldview of most of the leading scholars of the time. But it was a philosophy that was very capacious. It ran everything from game theoretic interpretations on one hand that had ambitions of science through completely humanistic, philosophical, highly critical in the philosophic sense, explorations of the nature of man and politics. And in that latter group, you know, there were Hans Morgenthau, not in his famous Politics Among Nations book, but in his more philosophic work, Stanley Hoffman, Raymond Aron, Hedley Bull, many characters who filled that. So that was the mainstream view, but in rivalry with it constantly was a still very vibrant form of Marxism that was inspirational, especially for many young people and a few older people as well. And that was the major rival. It was sort of Marxism, socialism versus realism was the dominant way in which world politics was then discussed in the late 1960s, early 1970s. It's changed a lot since then, of course.
And how did you see it develop?
It developed in a number of ways. Number one, realism became more sophisticated as a social science, and I give a lot of credit to Ken Waltz, who helped outline the framework of a more, let's call it, economistic, without any negative interpretation to that, but building upon the models of economic science, a general equilibrium kind of view of world politics. And his theory of international politics was very much a book of that sort, a book of deep fundamental theory. That was a major determinant in shaping the field. And then with the end of the Cold War, but of course drawing upon much older intellectual traditions, there came as well a movement towards liberalism as a more coherent way than earlier liberal insights of thinking about world politics. I think it's developing in a highly pluralistic way, and I think that's healthy. The dominance of realism in the 50s and 60s was not healthy. And it would be very unhealthy if liberalism, so to speak, took over international political science. I like to see a philosophic contest wherein different schools critically engage each other. I think it produces better work all around, even if it makes us look much less like a social science than our colleagues in economics, or increasingly these days in psychology. It makes us look much more like the discipline of philosophy. And I think that's not harmful to us. I think that's healthy given the complexity of the world. And within each of the fields, there have been very significant developments. You know, the biggest development in international security over the past 10 or 15 years has been the emergence of civil war studies. Civil wars combine inherently the study of domestic politics with the engagement of war that comes from international politics. Civil wars very rarely stand on their own. They often spill over borders. So again, the international and the comparative are inherently mixed in two. So we see comparative kind of themes to understand civil wars being investigated with international political lenses, methods, insights, and events, such as the study of war, for example, or the resolution of wars, peacemaking, or the punishment for wars through various forms of trials and tribunals and/or amnesties. And so a lot of the concerns of international politics have come into comparative politics, and in the Civil War studies we've seen a major significant thread of studies which has been extremely important and influential.
And how do you think would be the best way for this field to develop?
I'm maybe a conservative in the sense that I like the idea of the contest of faculties that we're engaged in. I would be very disappointed if something emerged as hegemonic so that we turned into a field like economics. I think it would be radically inappropriate to what we study. And therefore, I'm happy to keep up our tradition of contestation. I think it's interesting. I was talking about it the other day with a number of directors of universities. And here's the big issue. At the present time in the world, American universities, the leading American research universities, are leading on a global scale. And if you measure it by Nobel Prizes, where graduate students often want to go, publications, all of these kinds of things, the American universities are at the forefront. And they've been at the forefront since the later 1950s, largely benefiting from the horrible European Civil War, World War I and World War II, and what it did to the intellectual classes of Europe, many of whom migrated to the United States, giving us these wonderful Stanley Hoffmans and Albert Hirschmans, and I could keep up the list of the great European scholars who came here. The big question is what happens in the future? And, you know, should American universities try to globalize themselves so that they could hypothetically maintain a leadership role in the world as a whole? And the only way that could be done would be through globalization. You can't have a population in the United States of 300 plus million expect to be the leading and produce the leading world universities when China and India continue to grow, as they're likely to do, they'll each have populations of 1 billion. There's no reason to expect that American brains are 3 or 4 times better than Chinese or Indian brains. And so at some time in the predictable future, the greatest universities in the world will be in India and China. That's the natural flow of world history. So should American universities try to globalize themselves to maintain a global primacy, or should they recognize that they will be great American universities and sometime in the not too far future they'll be in competition with great Chinese and Indian universities? And as Europe begins to coalesce, I'm one of those rare people who think it will continue to do so, the European political and economic space is likely to move resources into the university world to further revive the great revival of the European universities that's been taking place over the past 20 years. So will we have a world where American universities stay on top of the whole world, or will we have great universities continuing in Europe and the United States and elsewhere in the world facing very significant competition from soon-to-be great Chinese and Indian universities? So what's the world going to look like? You know, will it be academically multipolar, or will it become academically unipolar, with the American universities able to deepen and expand? And that's a big issue that some universities are beginning to think about. You know, places like Harvard with $30 billion have enormous resources. Should they imagine them some days as a university with $60 or $100 billion, with campuses around the world all integrated into one? Or should it stay a great American university in future friendly rivalry, academic rivalry, with great Indian, Chinese, European universities? It's a big question out there.
And intellectually, do you think that there's going to be a change in terms of what are the disciplines and the relations between the disciplines?
That's a it's a very interesting question. Disciplines do change. Our field, international relations, is a 20th century invention. There were great philosophers of war and of the rivalry among independent polities going back to Thucydides. But as a broad substantive field, this is a 20th century field. And so these fields do change. Ours is clearly new. I would imagine new fields will emerge as the world changes. Imagine for a moment that we have a deepening of global governance, that the WTO continues to strengthen. The UN is revived in some way that makes it more effective and coherent, or the G20 emerges and acquires a political as well as a economic identity to it, and acquires legal authority attached to it as well. So imagine we have a lot more global governance. I would imagine there would then be an emerging field of global governance that would draw upon constitutional law, comparative constitutional law, international politics, domestic politics, but now played out across national identities. It would build upon the field of European studies, also emerging, and be a global equivalent to it that would look quite different from what we now do in our standard political science departments here in the US, where we divide ourselves up into international relations, American politics, comparative politics, methodology, and political theory. That's sort of the American model of political science. That model is not conducive to the understanding of global governance, which stretches across all of those fields and requires itself as a form of study that's inherently integrated. So I could imagine global governance folks, either, unless they get accommodated, and it'll be difficult to accommodate. We academics are conservative by nature, that they might hive off and form global governance departments. And because it'll be a hot topic, will acquire resources, hire faculty, and someday political science might look a little old-fashioned in that mix, and we might slip in decline a little bit. And I think those are serious possibilities.
So do you think that those theme-related departments or centers were likely to develop in other areas, such as environment?
I think it's quite likely in the environment. To do well in the environment, you have to have a serious understanding of enough science that you can read the science journals on, on carbon capture and things such as that, and not just be baffled by them. But at the same time, you have to know enough economics that you can seriously engage in a discussion of various, schemes for mitigation and adaptation, and evaluate them in a relatively rigorous way. So to do that today, you've got to get a science degree, maybe as an undergraduate, and then an economics or a law degree as a graduate. And there'll be demand for professionals that will exceed these haphazardly constructed programs. There'll be demands for credentialing, that'll come forward. And with that, I could well imagine environmental programs being structured and put up that meet that kind of demand, that'll give you enough of those together and credential you as somebody who can do the mix. So I could imagine an environmental program coming up in this kind of a way as well. And there are others we could conceive of. We are responsive to the changes in the world. We may help create some of them, but mostly we're responsive. But usually late. Universities are very slow. I once heard Nan Cohen, the former president of Duke University, say in a conversation with one of her trustees, explaining that it always took longer to achieve change in a university. And the trustee responded to her, in that case, if I ever hear that the world is coming to an end, I'll move to Duke University, because things always take a year longer there. And that's true about our universities as well.